Well, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasant honor this evening to introduce Robert J. Gatje, who is the author of Great Public Spaces, published by Norton in 2010, and our speaker for this evening. Bob Gatje is a graduate of the Bachelor of Architecture program with high honors at Cornell University in 1951, and since then has had a long and distinguished career, working first with the firm of Marcel Breuer and the Breuer successors, and then with Michael Graves. As you probably know well, both Breuer and Graves were American Institute of Architects AIA medal winners and among the most influential and admired architects of their generations. Bob Gatje's earlier book, Marcel Breuer, a memoir, is an intimate and revealing portrait of this great figure of early modernism in American architecture. Throughout his long career, and then more intensely since his retirement from active practice, Bob Gatje has been pursuing his personal fascination with urban spaces, an understudied topic, I would say, among both historians and architects in the United States. He's assembled for our edification and delight a list of 40 squares that he analyzes through text, images, and then, by far most importantly, very powerful measure drawings that graphically impress upon us the characteristics that make these spaces so important. He tells us in his introduction that he was inspired by the earlier work of three principal, or actually four principal, historian architects. First, Camillo Sitte, the Austrian architect whose book Der Städtebau of 1889 tried to look at urban space from an artistic perspective. And one of my favorites, Werner Hegemann and Albert Piet's Civic Art, The American Vitruvius, that dates from 1922. And finally, a more recent text, the German architect and historian Paul Zucker, and his 1959 book, Town and Square. Bob Gatje is an urban connoisseur, I would argue, not just a collector of urban spaces, but a careful selector of the ones that are most successful. He's focused, not surprisingly, on the West and naturally privileges examples from Mediterranean cultures, especially Italy. If your culture lives outdoors, eats in the open, and celebrates in public, then we can expect them to evolve public spaces that reinforce those activities. His selection is surprisingly resistant to the work of his own time and country. Boston's Lewisburg Square is the hub's only entry in his pantheon, and Seattle's Pioneer Square the only site from the second half of the 20th century that managed to make the grade, and deservedly so in my opinion. Since Boston's City Hall Plaza, sadly, has the ignominious distinction of being the poster child for the Project for Public Spaces Hall of Shame, I can only hope that the nearby Christian Science Church Plaza might receive a more generous review from Mr. Gatje, especially as we move towards its hoped-for designation as a Boston landmark soon. So please join me in welcoming Robert Gatje.
Thank you, Keith. And since this is being recorded, I'd better change the record. I've never even met Michael Graves. I was a partner of Richard Meyer.
Oh my God. So we got back out. Sorry.
Anyway.
How did I make that mistake? Oh, wait.
Very pleased to see you all here tonight. Very great pleasure to be back in Boston and to have walked around one of my favorite buildings, Trinity Church, for a good part of this morning. I started this book about 6 years ago, and the idea, besides having just a new idea for a new book, it was probably a reference book that I had in mind for architects, because I remembered in the offices that I'd worked in, when we ever had an assignment for urban space, people were always shouting, "Hey, how wide is San Marco?" or "How high is the Campidoglio?" or this, that, and these things were not easily found. We had to dig out book after book in the library and so forth. So to some extent, the book starts with the idea of putting it all together in one place. And then, of course, when I started that, I saw hey, this is a good opportunity to make some nice drawings, and then maybe the public might be interested. So at any rate, I went to speak to John Reps, my professor and friend at Cornell, famous writer about American architecture and space. And he told me there were these three great books that Keith referenced. We all went, those of us who went to architecture school, we all remember the drawings of Camillo Sitte. They're little drawings about yay big, black and white, but they had this marvelous ability of allowing us to compare one space to the other because they were all drawn at the same scale. So I took that idea from him and simply made them somewhat larger. Another book that influenced mine was by Alan B. Jacobs called Great Streets. And if you don't know that book, you really should know it. It's a marvelous book by a marvelous thinker and draftsman who I had only one argument with, and that is the direction that you show your shadows. The book by Sitte was published and used throughout Europe for many, many years before it finally was turned into English by Hegeman and Peetz. And it was their publication of his drawings that made his work known throughout the scholarly world of England and America. And all of those drawings, to the extent that the publisher remembered to do it, are all published at the same scale. Sometimes I found that the later edition of some book had been republished and reprinted, and before you know it, the drawing is out of scale. But by all odds, the greatest man who gave me the ideas that I will be talking about tonight is Paul Zucker. He was a professor in New York City at the New School in Cooper Union. And what he did with squares was to remind us that it's not a flat drawing on a piece of paper. It has three dimensions. And that if we talk about architecture, we've got to also talk about space. You talk about volume versus void, yin and yang. And if streets are rivers, he said, squares are the lakes. This sense of enclosure, which is required in any good square, has to be combined with pleasant usefulness. And he suggested as a thing you could think about was that the square is a vessel for space. Think of it as a teacup. If the lip is too low, or if there are cracks or holes in the vessel, space leaks out all over town. Now, squares can be square. There are also rectangles, circles. There are lots of ovals. There's one famous octagon, and there are even several intriguing trapezoids. If we take one of these squares for an example, Place des Vosges in Paris, you look at it and say, well, here's the plan. That's easy. That's a nice big square. And in fact, if you look at it, if you look at it as a cul-de-sac, which it was when it was built, everybody had to come in this direction and you never got out. But this corner is going to appear later in some of my photographs. The size or the height of the wall for each square is something that people think about now. In those days, they didn't have to think about it. They were mostly residential squares, and without elevators, they were 4 or 5 stories walk up, so that the average of 65 feet came into common use. But actually, the side of a square, the taller the better, except to the extent that if you're looking straight across the square, everything above 27 degrees tends to fade out. So that's not a bad test for the dimensions of a square. And remember that a square should have sides that are a wall, not a fence. Shouldn't feel that the space is leaking out over the fence. Once you've come up with the space and the size, a big hunk of space, you tend to fill it up. Trees and grass and fountains, and we continue to change it. Now, in Paris, In 1639, they had a statue as the only thing in the middle of the Place des Vosges.
Excuse me, are you using the mic?
I think I am.
Oh, okay.
1, 2, 3, woof woof, hello Mac. Can you hear it? Maybe I should get it closer.
Yeah.
All right, try that.
Thank you.
In 1680, they'd added some grass. In 1783, they took away the statue due to a certain revolution, and they reorganized the greenery. 1797, they got a new statue, and Cartesian rectilinearity began to plan the placement of all the new trees that were lined up in every direction. And fountains and continuously changing tree patterns have been characteristic of the Place des Vosges since 1820. When you're making the drawings of a three-dimensional series of spaces, you have to worry about the fact that this obelisk, for example, in front of St. Peter's, is very tall, but it looks pretty flat if you just draw it this way. You can cast a shadow from that, and naturally, if your drawing has got north at the top, the sun is in the bottom, and Alan B. Jacobs used that as a truth and had all of his shadows pointing upward. In fact, I think if you look at it, you'll see that what you're looking at is an object that appears to be on stage with the footlights below it. I was in the Army in the Corps of Engineers as a topographic computer, and I was taught that for an aerial photograph, you want to point the shadows always downward, and that enables you to feel the growth of the object coming toward you. So, like it or not, my sun is always in the northwest corner, and there is some particular day of every year that I think theoretically that shadow might be cast. The Greeks and Romans didn't make all that much about squares. They used squares to display their buildings, but not people. If they enclosed people, it was for games. This stadium in Venetian was small by those things in those days in Rome. It held 30,000 people. And the footprint of that stadium is still to be found in the middle of Rome as the famous Piazza Navona. 14 centuries later, it's still there as the echo of a game playing time. And look, Ma, there's no leaks of the space. If you approach the Piazza Navona from the east, there are two masterpieces by the great Baroque competitors, Francesco Borromini and Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Can you imagine what it must have been like to be living in the same town at the same time when two great figures like Bernini and Borromini were competing for jobs? And architects must have been absolutely out of their mind in those days. In the mid-17th century, the Church of Sant'Agnese in Agony, now agony is a Greek word that refers to games. It has nothing to do with St. Agnese being tortured to death or anything like that. The award was given to Borromini, who was a friend of Pope Innocent X, who happened to live next door. That's his house, and this is the church. Innocent flooded the marketplace in 1652 to keep his Roman citizens cool in the summer, and it still works. And space is definitely not going to leak out of that corner. Three ordinary palazzos set at slight angles to one another echo the round end of the stadium. And Bernini won the competition for the fountains. Simon Schama says of the Four Rivers, as it's called, surely the greatest water spectacle in any urban space in Europe. And the obelisk seems to be hanging from the sky. Each corner is named after a river, and if those of you who go to movies, you'll remember that Tom Hanks rescued the Cardinal from the Rio de la Plata on the left in Dan Brown's Angels and Demons. 300 miles north, there's another oval space, square that recalls an ancient Roman forum. And there are actually two squares to be thought about. The Piazza della Erbe, which is a source of all the marketplaces in town, and a quiet square where the rich and famous lived their quiet lives. And between the two, a dramatic, tense, narrow passageway. And the three-dimensionality of this combination of two squares with this link, I think is one of the most dramatic to be found almost anywhere. The eastern wall is crowned by the Lamberti Tower, one of my favorite towers from anywhere. It took 3 centuries to build, and in every century they changed the architectural scale and style. So you have a Romanesque base, Gothic shaft, and a Renaissance little tower at the top. This picture is taken on a Sunday, the only time you can take pictures because the market is closed and the market umbrellas are folded down. On a more usual day, this is the typical market, and this is the archway that leads through to the Piazza Signori at the other side. And this is as you exit from that connection into the calm dignity of the place where the evil people who ran the town lived all the time. The other remarkable thing about this experience is, talk about 3 dimensions. You could start in the Erbe, walk through this tense little tunnel, get out into Signoria, then into the former market courtyard of the town hall, and then march up this marvelous set of flight of stairs and into the tower stairs, and finally you come out of the top and you look back at the Della Erbe where you started. 150 miles south, there's another pair of squares. They're named after their well and the cathedral. San Gimignano is known for towers. It used to have 72 of them. 17 of them still stand. But it was really a town that came into its own at the time of 1872 when Italy was finally made into a country. Prior to that, Italy had been a series of city-states, usually at war with one another, and a king came along and put them all together. And he had this brilliant idea that if you want people to feel that they're Italian, they have to know all of Italy. And that means they want to visit their neighbors and perhaps appreciate them and so forth. So he set a committee in charge of each of the great city-states and asked them to give them an architectural quality, a character that would attract tourists. And this plan continued right through the fascistic times of Mussolini. And we have good luck to thank, I think, that Mussolini had good taste and his people were chosen, they were pretty good designers. The first thing they did was to strip off all the facades. They were apparently quite a messy bunch of stone and wood and veneers of one sort or another that had accumulated over time. They found a lot of rough stone underneath, which they thought looked pretty good. And they thought that they could consider that that's what they might have looked like in medieval days. So San Gimignano, which was far from a typical or marvelous medieval city, became one. They looked carefully to find evidence of medieval traces, and when they couldn't find one, they made it up. In this corner, you can see that they wanted to make a tight neck between the two squares, so they copied the loggia from Florence and built it there because they found evidence that there had once been at least the trace of a loggia at that point. Okay, now this is the way it looked to start with. That was the town hall, rather a mess, and this was the cathedral. It had a Baroque facade that was painted on the plaster of the church. the guys who had the design assignment turned the town hall into a crenellated blind arcade building of some considerable quality. And this is the loggia that they put in there, and there's been the tower they left alone, and the great church, thank goodness, it stands there today as the, what do you want to call it, the accident of a good idea by some architectural committee. It's just marvelous the way this came about. Now, do you think of this as a town or a stage set? Well, it's sort of a stage set, but it brought and brings the tourists to San Gimignano. Now, I want you to travel with me back in time and across the ocean to something that, in a remarkable way, is quite comparable. The Spaniards decided they wanted to send a troop of soldiers north to create a capital for what became New Mexico. And they did this in Santa Fe in 1610. And the King Philip II had developed a very good rule book for how you create a town in a new, how you create the center of a new town that is to become capital of a state for the king. And this rule book told you that you needed a place for a palace for the governor, and you needed a place for a church, and this and that. And the first thing that they built was the Palace of the Governors, right there. And that's the one and only building we know that still stands where it was. All the rest have been changed over time for one reason or another. And the cathedral, which is off this drawing, is no longer a part of the square because they turned what had been a double square into a single square to simplify matters. The double square had originally been sized so that the troops could give Saturday morning marching demonstrations in front of the governor's palace. Now, this is what the governor's palace looked like in the 1880s. Remember, it had been started in 1610, and there are drawings and etchings and watercolors and paintings of the governor's palace, being the principal building of Santa Fe, but every one of them looks different. They all have columns, yes, but the columns look differently. They are usually whatever was fashionable at the time that the painter or the draftsman was making his drawing. This is identified as the oldest public building in the United States, and it's probably true. The rest of town looked like pretty much an ordinary American Wild West town until somebody, it actually was a man, John Goa Beams, got the idea that it could all be bound together if every building in the town square had an arcade. At this time, it had nothing like that. John Goa Beams, by the way, was a very interesting architect. He'd come west because he had tuberculosis, and he settled in, I think he came from Brooklyn, and he settled in the 1920s in Santa Fe. These portales, the Spanish word for the columns or the arcade, became the characteristic object of the town. In 1915, there was a World's Fair in San Diego, the Panama Californian Exposition, and New Mexico decided they needed a state building. The problem was a state building should demonstrate New Mexican architecture, and nobody knew what New Mexican architecture was. So they hired a group of architects named Rapp and Rapp to design a state building for them at that World's Fair. Now, the one thing we know that they found was this shape, which is a replication of the old Acoma Mission, which is about 50 miles outside of Santa Fe. The rest was pretty much innovation on their part. Rapp and Rapp was famous at that time, not for their architecture, but for their movie theaters. Those of you who are old enough to remember the Lowe's Kings or other great movie theaters in town, you went inside and saw gilded Spanish Baroque walls and a blue sky overhead with twinkling stars. That was Rap and Rap. And they're the people who invented the architecture of Santa Fe. The building was such a success at the square, at the fair, that they took it down and rebuilt it here at a corner of the square, where it is today the New Mexican Art Museum. And in the 1920s, there was a local historian, Jesse Nussbaum, who kept poring over documents and drawings and so forth, try to find some evidence of what the plaza might have looked like. And he redesigned the facade of the governor's palace. And it really is quite a handsome wooden arcade with a pillar form at either end that's really quite successful. When a famous painting was made in 1922 by Gerald Cassidy, he called it The End of the Trail at Santa Fe. This was used in the calendar for the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe to demonstrate what that part of America might have looked like in the olden time. But you'll find that he used Nussbaum's version of the governor's palace to illustrate his painting. And under that arcade is the best jewelry shop in town. And this is what the square looks like today. Every building has its own portale, but they're different. But it really does give you a sense of an enclosure, a sense of uniformity. And the last one was built in 1988. So if you have friends who live in Santa Fe and they're very proud of their adobe architecture and all the history that it represents, you might remind them that they're dealing with something rather more recent than that. So at the same time, two things were happening in the 20s. In Italy, the fascists were building something for their purposes, and the Americans were building something back here in Santa Fe. The one thing that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe wanted, if they were going to extend the railroad finally to Santa Fe, was a big hotel. So they hired Memes to rebuild an old inn at the end of the Santa Fe Trail, turn it into a grand hotel called La Fonda. Problem is that the railroad never got to Santa Fe. It stops at Albuquerque. When I got around to making drawings of squares from you-know-where, Venice was full of plenty of good drawings of the Piazza San Marco. And the best one of them is this famous etching by Georges Gromont. He published it in 1910 along with etchings of other famous squares around the world. I found this in a good edition, 1944 third edition in Paris, and used it as the basis for my own drawing. It helps me locate the ground plans or the footprint of each of the buildings that form the great piazza. In other books, you can find the floor plan of St. Mark's, the ceiling plan, and as I started to add these things to the drawing, it begins to come alive. And at the scale of 1 to 1,000, it just barely fit within the 11 inches by 11 inches that my publisher said I could use for the book. Lucky, lucky. Finally, this is the drawing that came out of it, with the shadows pointing down, and I hope they give it a sense of three-dimensional reality. There's a marvelous book about San Marco, by the way, written by Jeffrey Baker, called The Design Strategies in Architecture. It's not just about San Marco, but he has everything you'd ever want to know about San Marco in his book. This great square is made up of 8 masterpieces. You start with the Basilica, the Palace, the Library, the Mint, the office buildings that were there, the clock tower, and finally the great Campanile. There were lots of architects involved, and the buildings resemble one another sometimes and sometimes not at all, but they are always respectful of their neighbors. how in the world, over all those centuries, they got these architects to respect one another and follow the idea that the piazza was the thing that had to be created and preserved. I can't imagine, because these were giants. You didn't get to build a building in San Marco unless you were somebody. And it's one of the great achievements of architecture to be found anywhere. When you approach the square from the Grand Canal, you can see 6 out of 8 of these buildings right away in front of you. And you can approach the square through one of its several entrances along what they call the Piazzetta, between the library on the left and the Doge's Palace on the right. This final, rather improbable skin for the Doge's Palace keeps architects and engineers wondering how in the world you could combine the solid wall up above the top floors of the palace into something that could be contained and supported by a series of round-headed arches, which are Romanesque, and then turn them into the rondelles that come down onto Venetian Gothic arches, and then finally down onto pointed columns down at the bottom. It's like no other building in the world, and John Ruskin was very proud of the work that was produced there. It's a marvel. And its neighbor, the Basilica of St. Mark's, is a treasure of great complexity and great achievement. And thank goodness for Photoshop. My 2 enemies when I was traveling around taking pictures was weather and scaffolds. If you planned to be 3 days in one town and it was raining for all 3 days, the square might very well have dropped out of my book. And this tower was enshrouded in a wooden scaffold, but I just moved this tower over there thanks to Photoshop. It works. Now this is not a picture of mine. I pulled it out of the internet, but it shows a remarkable effect, an optical effect of the fact that the square in St. Mark's is a trapezoid, and you're down at the narrow end here, looking down a space, the arms of which are gradually spreading out in front of you. And I think it's not my imagination. I ask you to join me in saying that from here, it makes this great basilica, a huge building, look like it's a little jewel box, something small and precious. It's a remarkable effect. It's a known optical effect that the sides of a trapezoidal space will achieve. Now there are actually 2 great squares in Venice, and they're 2,000 feet apart. San Marco is here, and the Campo di San Giorgio e Paolo is up here. Now, just 2,000 feet doesn't sound much, especially if you're trying to find your way through narrow little corridors. The best way is to take the Vaporetto and go around and find the Ospitale, which is what one part of the square up there is used for. I had a problem in that I needed accurate drawings, what are called cadastral drawings, the drawings that any city of any standing will publish as an accurate record of ownership and shape and size of all the real estate that's in their town. And I had sent many emails to the building department at Venice, and none of them were replied to. So the drawing I was looking for looks like this. And what I did on a Sunday afternoon was to go to the garden at the bottom of the space next to San Marco and got some poor tourist agent lady to look through a very thick yellow registry of all the city departments of Venice. And she finally tracked down for me the building department, not far, but a little hard to find. And she said that if I got there at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, they should be able to, if anybody could find the drawing, they could find the drawing. So I turned up there and found that there was already a line of people waiting to be taken care of. There were plumbers and carpenters and owners of apartments who wanted to extend their kitchen and that sort of thing that you would find on a Monday morning in the building department. Now, I didn't speak very good Italian, certainly not in any great technicality sort of way, but I did have an example of the drawing that I wanted, and there were a few people who spoke a little bit of English, and between the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of us, we started to find out that in the back of the room there was somebody who had flat files with the cadastral drawings. So once it was discovered that there was a man and there were drawings, I started to get on the end of the line because I had noticed that everyone had taken a number from the overhead control, like in a supermarket. Oh, but no, they would by that time not hear of the great architect from New York. Couldn't go to the back of the line, he had to go to the front of the line, which I did, and I got the drawing. And the drawing was used to make this plan of the rather strange L-shaped space. It's made up of the School of St. Mark's, which became the library of town and is now the hospital, the Church of San Giovanni e Paolo, and a certain large statue. And these 3 objects create a very interesting space that is truly extraordinary. The architecture of the library or the school or the hospital is hard to trace. Is this Byzantine or Renaissance or what? It's just a building that's famous in itself. The cathedral, which the locals call San Zanipolo, is about as close to a Gothic church as the Italians ever came. And the statue on the right is that of Condottiere Bartolomeo Colleoni. Now, he was a hired gun who ran armies for one city-state after another, whoever paid him the most. Very famous figure. And when he was about to die, before he would agree to work for Venice, he had insisted that someday a statue of him had to be built and placed in front of St. Mark's. So he died, and the people of town, knowing what a thug he was, said, well, we're not going to put it in front of the Basilica of St. Mark's. And somebody said, wait a minute, we've got the School of St. Mark's. If we change the word in that agreement, we can do it. So they hired Andrea Verrocchio in 1496, and he made a very powerful and beautiful statue, stands there by the side of the church. And this is what the square looks like from the canal. It's not bad as a second string square for a place. Now there's another better known L-shaped piazza called the Signoria in Florence. You may be surprised that architects have a thing about L shapes, but I can't really quite explain it. As a shape in facade or plan or so forth, it seems to have its weakness, possibly that it's going to break apart at the joint where the 2 rectangles come together. At any rate, there's a marvelous book written by Marvin Trachtenberg, a great figure in architectural history, called The Dominion of the Eye. He devotes an entire book to the details of how this square came about. And the remarkable thing about it is that it wasn't created, it wasn't built positively, it was built negatively. What happened was that there were 2 families at this corner who'd gotten into a fight, and they each lost, and their houses were torn down. So suddenly, in the middle of town, there was this space available, and somebody got the idea, hey, let's make it a square. Let's make it a square, and let's put the town hall. They didn't have a town hall, so they said, well, we'll start building a Palazzo Vecchio right there at the corner of that little square. Now, squares were technically difficult for the people who were governing the town, and the Medicis were in charge of Florence at the time, and you didn't make a square very big because that meant a lot of people could gather in the middle of it and they might start a riot. Finally, the time came when the Medicis were completely sort of solidly placed in control of Florence, and they felt that they could continue to take down buildings and create a bigger and bigger square and a bigger and bigger town hall. As you come down the street from the Duomo, the first view that you have of this rather incredible building is seen from the three-quarter point. It was a very carefully calculated viewpoint, according to Trachtenberg, that was refined by taking down walls and rearranging things so that as you walked down the street and finally came around the corner, saw this remarkable building, you said, wow. Now, it sounded a little bit out of belief when I first heard that Trachtenberg claimed that the Medicis had spent millions and millions of whatever lira it was at the time to just improve the appearance of their town hall, but it appears to be true. And I ask you to look at that building carefully and try to imagine how in the world it came to be. The combination of this tall tower, which is not unlike other towers in that part of Italy, standing upon the facade of the building right below it, and then these are all cantilevered out in front of the main facade below. It's some architect, it was actually a sculptor named Arnolfo di Cambio who designed it all, and what he was thinking about, I don't know, but it is a remarkable, beautiful, and challenging building to watch. And you look back at the square, the L, and you recognize actually that with this two pieces of statue and frequently a lot of kiosks set up here, the L turns into two rectangles that happen to be adjacent to one another. And at the main entrance to the Palazzo Vecchio, there are two statues, Heracles by Bandinelli and a certain David. Now, about a mile apart, with the Victorian cathedral at the knuckle, the middle of the 14th century saw the end of the Middle Ages and the start of the Renaissance. Here you are, the last square we were looking at, one of the great ones of the Middle Ages. The Duomo is here. It's actually a Victorian building. And finally, down at this end, there was a church called Santissima Annunciata that was used for the setting of a building that was to be a hospital for abandoned orphans. And in 1421, Filippo Brunelleschi was given the job of designing this building. He wasn't an architect, he was a goldsmith. He was part of a powerful labor union that happened to be able to get the job, and he had visited Rome, so he knew about arcades, but that's about all we know. He also had a very talented friend, a potter, called Andrea della Robbia, and he asked him to design a series of terracotta rondelles to decorate his arcade. And in some respects, those beautiful little blue and white children are more memorable for this square than anything that Brunelleschi did. This is the Grand Duke Ferdinand standing in front of his arcade. And directly across the square, the architect, excuse me, this is just to remind you of it. There is a building designed by another architect that became exactly the same. The two were made to face one another, and the architect, whose name I've escaped here in passing too quickly, liked Brunelleschi's work so much he just imitated the facade. 1534 was quite a year. Pope Paul III had just made peace with Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and the top of the Capitoline Hill in Rome was a mess. It was featuring a building that was used by the Senate, a masonry mess, and a building next to it called the Conservatory Palace. The same year, Michelangelo quit Florence and came to Rome because he figured that's where the money was. And he died there 30 years later. He was given the assignment by the Pope to renovate and restore some dignity to the top of the Capitoline Hill. He took the Senate building and turned it around. Its entryway used to be here, facing the Roman Forum. The entrance is here now with a heroic stairway and a pool. He took the old conservatory palace, put a new facade on it, and built a replica of that same facade on the opposite side of the space. Since the angle of this relationship here was not exactly 90 degrees, it was off by 8.5 degrees, he imitated the same angle at the other side because he was a great believer in symmetry. And look at what happened. It's another trapezoid. And finally, he called upon the people to donate a famous statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius that was standing by the Lateran Cathedral, and moved it here to the center on a platform that Michelangelo designed. He died before most of these buildings were finished, but he had a terrific bunch of architectural friends who were willing to help him create his masterpiece. As you approach the center from below, it appears to rise out of the ground in a most remarkable way, till it finally stands on its own pedestal, 2 stories above a pedestal, and the 2 flanking buildings are 2 stories high, and there's Marcus Aurelius in the middle. It's actually a copy of the original statue, and people who know these things better than I do say it's a bad copy, but I think it looks fine. And he placed that in the middle of one of the most famous floorscapes of any square in the world. It's been copied 10, 15 times. And I think, because you'll say, the space is leaking out, that the way that the 2 arms come together, looking out over all of Rome, it tends to hold the space close to you as if it's grasping the space within its arms. In any case, I'm not going to argue with Michelangelo. When it comes to St. Peter's in Rome, we got a problem. There were lots of architects who had worked on it. Donato Bramante, Domenico Fontana, Michelangelo, and Carlo Maderna. They'd all worked on St. Peter's and done various different things, some good, some bad. But Alexander VII was a great patron of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, and he wanted to give the task of designing a space in front of it to Bernini. Now, the church had started as a Greek cross, and the front sections to make it into a Latin cross, after all it was the Roman Catholic Empire, was given to Maderna. He not only extended the church forward, but he put a facade in front of it that we have to assume he was told to make it as big and bawdy as you could possibly imagine, and he did. Now, Fontana had already erected the obelisk in the middle of the square. It was standing there, and there's a marvelous story about the number of hours and days and people it took to move the obelisk from about 500 feet away to the center of the axis of the church, and then somehow to erect it with horses pulling on ropes and everything. And Fontana knew that if anything happened, he was in trouble. And the story is that he had a carriage with 6 horses waiting for him on the outskirts of Rome. But it worked. It got placed. And the work that finally was contributed by Maderna included one good thing. He designed that fountain, and Bernini liked it so much he put in an absolute duplicate next to it. But the cathedral, the basilica facade itself, I don't know. I think I'm not alone in architectural world of saying that it's grossly overscaled. It seems designed to make people look like ants. And frankly, the Pope is not looking much taller than that when he gives his blessing from his window, looking down at huge crowds of thousands of people. Is that architecture or is that stage management or what? I don't know, but it's not my favorite building. But I want to go back for just a moment and look at that square. Excuse me. Paul Zucker says, look at that space in front of the church. Look what Bernini did. He cants these two arms of the square inward, creating a trapezoid. He surely knew the effect that relationship had upon the appearance of San Marco. Was he doing it to try to make the facade of Moderna's look smaller? I tried this idea out on a friend who teaches architectural history at NYU, and she said, Bob, you're out of your mind. This was the Vatican Palace. He had to build this wall according to where it was, and then he just made it symmetrical. Well, I tend to think that I prefer to think of the idea that Zucker suggested. And when you look back at the square, not square at all, it's an oval and a trapezoid and a this and a that. It's interesting to note that Bernini wanted a two-story arcade with a Palladian motif along the top, because he saw, as you can see, that this isn't tall enough to enclose the space. But the Pope said it cost too much. The last great medieval square in Europe is in Prague, and it's made up of about 8 or 9 fine buildings that were built over 7 centuries. And it is a remarkable example of how different styles and different purposes can all be melded together into an envelope of a great space. Someone spoke about this problem of creating the spatial effect of a square as saying that there is a magical moment in the creation of a great square when the facades of each individual building leap from the building and join hands with their neighbor and create the interface of a square. It's a marvelous idea, and I don't know who wrote it. I've read it somewhere and I've been looking for it ever since. It's a great way of thinking of a square as a composition of facades that it doesn't own, except as they're just put together over time. Now this square is made up of a town hall, two great churches, several great palaces, and a monument to Jan Hus, the great Czech guy who was burned at the stake in, I don't remember where. As you can see, if you look at it, its buildings actually come close to one another, and some of them bite into the edge of their neighbor, and definitely enclose the space in a very specific way. The Czechs love to make crazy towers. This is the Church of Our Lady before Tin, and it's similar to the towers to be found
It's
elsewhere.
8 o'clock.
Whoops. That's my computer has just reminded me it's 8 o'clock. This is the tower of the town hall with its astronomical clock at the base. And St. Nicholas is a remarkable church built in the High Baroque by Kilian Dientzenhofer. And what's remarkable about this church is that its entrance is over here, the apse is here, and creates a mark for the end of the Paritzstrasse. But the two towers are put on the side of the church so as to reflect its respect for the square next to it. So there it is, a church, a square with everything for everybody. Back to the Place des Vosges in Paris. Hilary Ballon was a professor at Columbia, has written a marvelous book called The Paris of Henri IV, in which she describes 4 or 5 projects that were built in the very short time that Henry IV lived. He was assassinated shortly after he came into the throne. But one of the first things he did was he had a financial problem as king. And he had heard that the Italians were doing good things with silk. So he said to his people, can't we make silk? Sure we can make silk. We've in fact got an old silk mill on the edge of town. So he said, fine, let's do something about it. So the silk mill was right here. And you approached it along this roadway. And somebody in his group of architects, unknown and unnamed, got the idea that if they offered land along the edges of this square, and it is a true square, to people who wanted to buy it, they could give them the land, provided that they built a facade that matched exactly a design that had been made by the court architects. And it's a nice design. And people thought, well, sure, that's a good idea. And it started with an arcade which would have shops on it for selling silk. And then the Piano Nobile would be where the owner lived. And then the people who worked in his plant would be up in the attic space up above. And it was such a great thing. It was finished in 7 years. In fact, it was finished at a time when they decided the silk business wasn't going to work at all. So they tore down the silk mill and finished off the square with a 4th side identical to the other 3. This is what it looked like shortly after it was finished. It was empty. It was used for useful things like jousting matches to celebrate a royal engagement. But notice that the backyards are all different. All that they have in common is the same facade on the square. Right after the Second World War, this is what that place looked like. Some of the buildings had been painted, others had fallen to wreck and ruin. Some had shutters hanging off their hinges. It was rather a mess, and it was a very poor part of town in the 3rd arrondissement. This is a picture I took in 1952, the first time I saw it as a student. And you see it's rather a dull and dreary place. And I want you to note the effect that the shutters have, in that when they're open, they cover most of the nice red brick, which is the principal architectural material of the square. And a few years later, André Malraux convinced the government to rebuild and restore a great many of the monuments of Paris, and this was one of his favorites. So that as you approach the square now from the lead-in road, this is the back of the King's Pavilion. And it's a brilliant composition of stone and brick without its shutters. And as you walk through, you come to see the Queen's Pavilion on the other side, and the entire square, which is a very big one, 470 feet on the side. It's one of the biggest in my book, which have an average of about 300 feet. The trees in the middle, I think, were left there to sort of throttle the space. Without those trees, it would have looked a bit too much. But right now, it's one of the great squares of the world. And this is that corner that I pointed out at the very beginning. They had to break open this last pavilion when the avenue was required for a bus route. But if you look at that corner from the other direction, the space doesn't leak out. And if you look carefully at these adjacent facades, you'll see they're not exactly the same. In fact, you can walk around and sort of chuckle as you see each person making his own tiny little adjustments to what the king's architects told him to build. Not too far away from that in Paris, there is a place called the Garden of the Royal Palace. Cardinal Richelieu had become the prime minister to Louis XIII in 1624, and he had a perfectly nice palace for himself as a cardinal, but he figured that as prime minister he needed a really good palace. So he found 2 or 3 that were rack and ruin here on the Rue Saint-Honoré, and he knew that he could get the money together to put them together into a proper palace. And the other thing he wanted was a nice garden behind his palace. Now it happened that the main wall of the edge of Paris ran right through that garden space on a diagonal. The problem was, what do we do with that wall? Well, Cardinal Richelieu did not have to worry about that. He had the wall torn down, he had his garden built, and he had a great architect named André Lenôtre brought forth from Versailles to complete the design of his palace and the first group of buildings that defined his garden. The problem was, and it wasn't a great one, but it was a problem, these palaces down here on the Rue Saint-Honoré were not symmetrically placed, so that if you looked back at them and the courtyards that they had, they made the center line of this garden off-center, and somebody had to face that design problem of how do you make a symmetrical garden out of an unsymmetrical situation. Well, in 1781, they had a new plan to build a new upper house when the old upper house burned down. And there was enough damage done to the palace that they were able to rebuild it in such a way that its courtyard was centered on the square behind it. The other thing, and Richelieu died obviously, and this place passed through many, many hands, including something like 6 people who happened to be Dukes of Orleans. And when I was trying to write my chapter on this square, I couldn't keep one Duke of Orleans separate from the next one. At any rate, there was a king named his nickname was the People's King. And he was short of money, and he got a guy named Victor Louis to design the facades of new buildings that he built inside the old buildings. Now, the old buildings were not supposed to have windows looking out on the Cardinal's garden, although in time, of course, everyone had finally pierced windows to look out on the garden. Now, the last minute, here along comes this guy who says, we're going to build new buildings inside. And it caused a great fracas, and the king won, and he chose a very good architect. And the space that sits there within the sides of the garden built by Victor Louis is one of the great hidden spaces in Paris. You have to know your way around to get into a little courtyard and then into passing a garden gate and so forth. And inside, there are no vehicles except for baby carriages. And if you're a daddy living there with a 3.5-year-old daughter, as I was at one point, you want to bounce a ball on Sunday afternoon, it's a great place to go. This is as you look out into the garden from the palace behind, which is now the Senate of France. There's a very nice pool in the middle where little boys love to sail sailboats. And the French know how to trim trees. Boy, do they know how to trim trees. This is Victor Louis' facade. It covers 6 stories, cleverly hidden behind arches and decoration and so forth. But it's very interesting to remind yourself that this is only a few miles away from the Place des Vosges. They have almost exactly the same proportion in terms of the composition of their facades. The center line of the columns is almost exactly the same. And his style was Italianate Renaissance, whereas the architects of the king had been designing a more horizontal composition that was coming out of French countryside. In the late 19th century, the place really went to rack and ruin. It was becoming a very, very sleazy sort of place. It was full of brothels and gambling dens, and very famous as a place to go for creating riots. In the 1920s, Colette and Jean Cocteau, who both lived in the square, got together a lot of committee members, and they raised some money, and they cleaned up the whole place and turned it into a very quiet, dignified space with elegant architecture and very nice little shops. If you want a medal in France, you go and buy them in these shops. And if you want toy soldiers, this is the place to go. Otto Kahn wanted to build a new Metropolitan Opera House because the downtown Met had run out of boxes, and it was held by all the great old families of New York. And his nouveau riche friends wanted boxes at the opera, and they needed a new opera house. And he found a piece of land in Hell's Kitchen, the 40s, that was held by Columbia University for their preparation of a new campus. Columbia decided to keep going north, and they sold, or rented actually, the space to Kahn. And he put together a group of architects, very good people. One guy who was really the leader named Ben Morris, Joseph Urban, Ralph Walker, Eli Jacques Kahn, and they were busy on working on an opera house with a square in front of it when the crash came. And the whole idea of building a new opera house was looking silly. So Kahn found a great friend, John R. Todd, a giant of the real estate business, who had an even greater friend named John D. Rockefeller Jr., to build something there. They didn't know quite what it would be, but they started in 1928. Rockefeller had told Todd, look, you can use your own architects, but I want something of a rather traditional sort. So we don't know that Todd has said this to himself, but he certainly got himself a great set of extra architects, none of whom were traditional at all. Harvey Wiley Corbett, Wally Harrison, and the great Raymond Hood. Rem Koolhaas has said of Rockefeller Plaza and Rockefeller Center, it's a masterpiece without a genius. Well, I think of Ray Hood as a genius. This is 30 Rock, as you see it from Saks Fifth Avenue. And Gertrude Stein has said it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, ever seen, ever seen. The side facades step back as the elevators are dropped off, but it was done by Ray Hood with such brilliance that it remains, in my view, the greatest skyscraper in the world. And I like to believe that it was inspired by some great exfoliating mountainous cliff. The entry from Fifth Avenue and Saks comes along this area called the Channel Gardens. I don't know whether you remember that that's called the Channel Gardens because the French building is on one side and the English building is on the other side. France and England are on the other side of the channel. They lead to a grand staircase that was supposed to lead down to a lower plaza where there would be more shops. But like most architects know, lower plazas never work. So they abandoned that as a place for shops, and it's now the ice skating rink in the wintertime, and it's a sea of umbrellas for the two great restaurants that occupy it in the summertime. And worst of all, the lower plaza was defined by flagpoles from 40 different countries when the UN was established. And I happen to think that that picket fence of flagpoles someday should be taken down because it ruins the appreciation of the double-sided, double-tiered square that is there. The one thing that did remain from the remarkable speed and time in which Rockefeller Plaza was built is terrific Art Deco decor. Lee Laurie was one of the great sculptors who left us Mercury, and this was an open grill an air intake that he turned into the story of mankind. And Paul Manship gave us Prometheus. When Boston asked me to come to speak tonight, they said, of course, you'll talk about Copley Square, no? And I said, well, Copley Square isn't in my book, you know that. Yeah, we know that. Talk about Copley Square and talk about Richardson Church. So I did a little research, and I think it's absolutely ridiculous for me to be talking to an audience here in Boston who knows more about Copley Square than I do. But anyway, here we are looking at 1880 when Richardson's Trinity Church was finished. The parish house was relocated in order to avoid conflict with Huntington Avenue, the Avenue of the Arts, that came through the square on a diagonal at the time. And it's said that Richardson told his chief designer that he wanted an arcade, a loggia put in front based upon San Trofim and Arles, which is here on the left. Sorry. That's San Trofim, and this is the portico designed by the successor firm, Shepley, Rutten and Coolidge, whose design partner, Charles A. Coolidge, has a granddaughter who's sitting here with us tonight. At the other end of the square, Charles Fulham McKim designed another great American building, the Boston Public Library, finished in 1895. And if you have a space that's bookended by two of the greatest buildings in America, it seems to me that you should be able to design a good square. It started out this way when Huntington Avenue plowed through the middle of it. Charles Fulham McKim left this sketch behind on yellow tracing paper showing what he would have put in front of his public library. There was another competition, a series of competitions that followed, and I learned everything that I know about this space from Phoebe Goodman, who used to work for the organization that controls Copley Square. A tunnel was proposed. Sasaki, Dawson, and DeMay won a 1968 competition. Holly White chaired another jury for another competition that finally was built. But Robert Campbell and others preferred the second place winner, which would have looked like this. I don't know. That's what you have to start with. And I'm not going to try to design Copley Square for you, but I think time will perhaps allow one to do something somewhat better than what is there to find today. And as an example, I want you to look at this great square. It's in the great city of Portland, Oregon, the Pioneer Courthouse Square, and it's the current finale of a spatial sequence that began in 1858 when they built the first public school in Oregon in this center square of a city checkerboard. The first real public building in the Northwest was the courthouse that gives it its name. And in 1890, the entire square was filled with a great hotel built for the arrival of the railroad and designed by McKim Eden White. It was torn down because it didn't have air conditioning. And in 1974, there was an inspired program put together by citizens of the city of Portland that said, no, we don't want another parking garage built in the center of town just to serve Macy's and the other shopping facilities that were on either side. And they held a competition. It was an internationally known and competed for competition. And it was won by a local guy, whose name is hidden here. I've got to move my... Will Martin was his name. And I know that most architects, when they hear that, they'll say, well, if it was an international competition and it was won by a local guy, it must have been set up from the very beginning. but it's actually not true. There's no question but that I've seen the solutions that were given in by great architects on the East Coast, and Martin's is much the better one. The construction started in 1981, and the idea makes much of the fact that the land falls 15 feet across this angle. This is the low end. And the design of the square, the spatial design of the square, has very much to do with the sculpting of the space that was available to them as they cut into the slope of the land and created a series of very useful amphitheater-like spaces. The square is dominated by brick. In fact, brick is used as a paving material for the streets all around the square, as the city recognized what a great space they had created. And all architects love this kind of an intersection. See, there's a ramp that was put in for baby carriages and the disabled. And the intersection of that ramp with each and every one of these stairs is a sculptural magnificence. Will Martin invented a stoa of unique sort of columns, and then he pushed several of them to the ground. This one, he uses the base of the column to provide a base for chessmen, and other columns are used to bracket flower carts and burritos. There's a lot of very useful street furniture, including a very complicated weather vane and street signs that point to everywhere. Now, one could wish, I think, that there were more trees to hide the ordinary buildings on this side, but I took this picture 3 years ago, and when I visited the other day to give this talk, they've taken down these trees so that now you can see the courthouse that gives the square its name. And it's a remarkable experience and a remarkable example of a civic-minded concentration upon how they use their own town square. They've also arranged things so that there's almost all of the trolley tracks and bus routes and so forth that go through downtown Portland come through this square and stop, so that everybody knows what's going on at the square. It's a market one day, it's a rock concert another day. They talked about covering it over. No, they wanted to keep it open to the sky. And it's used all the time. It's won all sorts of prizes for one of the great modern squares of America. Now, these are two squares that are almost exactly the same size and shape. Mayor Bloomberg has just given back...
The room just for 5 minutes.
Yeah, it's just over. Mayor Bloomberg has given back half of Times Square to the people. You may have read about that. Now, I don't think it will ever equal the Piazza di Spagna, but it's a Spanish step in the right direction. Thank you.